Hey guys, here we are. It's the last lecture of section 2. So let's finish out talking about the brain. And in this one, we'll talk about the midbrain and the hindbrain. So the mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. We'll start with the midbrain, the mesencephalon right here. And this is located between the hypothalamus and the pons. When you're looking at a brain to decide where you're looking at, always look for the lumpy pons and the cerebellum so you can get all oriented. And the components of the midbrain include the tectum and tegmentum. The tectum, this isn't a rat brain, this is not a human brain, this is a rat brain. It's control of eye movements and auditory reflex. So the superior colliculi, that's for visual reflexes, it's going to coordinate the movements of your head and your eye with a visual signal. And the inferior colliculi do the same thing with an auditory reflex. So you turn your head when you hear a sound, or you turn your head when you see a light, that's going to be reflexes related to light, and vision and sound, that's going to be in the tectum. The tegmentum, there's a lot more going on. Tegmentum has a lot of functions: sleep, arousal, and attention, and reflexes involved in that. So there's a number of components of the tegmentum. In the tegmentum, we have the reticular formation, substantia nigra, the red nucleus, the periaqueductal gray, and I apologize, I left one out, the VTA, ventral tegmental area. So please write that into your notes after periaqueductal gray, the VTA, and I'll mention that. So let's start with the reticular formation. And what the reticular formation is, it's a whole bunch of nuclei that come up through the brainstem and they project through the cortex and to the cerebral cortex and the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the cerebellum and the spinal cord. So it's a whole bunch of different nuclei that are going to, what they do is they receive sensory information and then they send signals to the rest of the brain. And it's also called a reticular activating formation. So it's important in attention and arousal, whether you can go to sleep, and your movements and reflexes related to that. And it's related in some degree to how much you're paying attention and how alert and aroused you are. I don't mean sexually aroused. I mean just like alertness and arousal, as you know, aroused versus sleep. And so just for a minute about attention. There's external attention and internal attention. External attention, that's going to be your prefrontal cortex, looking around and you're watching TV and you're thinking about different things and making plans for what you're going to do, and you look at your watch and it says 12 o'clock, so you eat. We tend to prioritize that. Babies prioritize internal attention. How are you feeling? Are you hungry? And so we'll eat because it's noon, but we don't pay as much attention to what is our body telling us. And that's mostly read by the insula and the posterior cingulate gyrus, which is activated during meditation. And so we often prioritize the external attention. So do you ever eat in front of the TV and not even being aware at all of what you're eating and how it tastes and how it feels, and are you full? Because we're focused on external things. But the internal world, the internal attention, is really, how do you feel? How do you feel about what's going on? And it can be important to try and increase your internal attention, to check in with your body. And there's ways to do that. You can't really wrestle it with your frontal lobe. You can't really control it that way. But meditation can be quite helpful for that, because we don't have that much control over our thoughts and even our attention. So if I told you right now, don't think about a clown, because clowns are scary. How many of you had an image of a clown go through your head, and you can't really tell yourself, don't think about the clown, don't think about the clown. You can't control your frontal lobe with your frontal lobe. Einstein said we can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. But if you're having racing thoughts, there's thoughts that you don't want to have. You don't want to think about your ex anymore. You don't want to think about cookies, whatever it is. Just kind of trying to control that with your frontal lobe doesn't work, because it's your frontal lobe that's doing that. So if you use another circuit to escape those racing thoughts that you might have, so meditation or breathing or focusing on where you are in the moment, which so many of us don't do. So anybody else with anxiety? Just focus on where you are in the moment. This one I find helpful. Just sit and say, what are 5 things I can see right now? And 4 things I can hear right now. 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you could taste. And play with the numbers if you want. You know, if you want to have your eyes closed, all you see are your eyelids. But focus on right now, your breathing, and what do you feel now? That can kind of shift that when you're obsessed and thinking about something and you can't really control it. Now, how do we pay attention? Really, we're kind of wired to pay attention to change. So if you're staring at something, literally, if you're staring at something that doesn't change, it will literally disappear from your vision. And a lot of us don't pay attention all that well. So just think about how often are you not thinking about what you're doing? When you're driving, aren't you like half the time, la la la, and you're on autopilot? They did a study of students, and on average, students were not thinking about what they were actually doing at the moment 30% of the time, and for others it was as high as 90% of the time. And you know this, you know when you're studying sometimes and you're just looking at your study guide and your lecture notes, your eyes are looking, but your brain is la 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 somewhere else. So think of what you're thinking about when you're not thinking about what you should be paying attention to. Are you making a to-do list? Are you thinking about your ex? Are you thinking about how you're feeling? And actually take some time and deal with those things that your brain obviously wants to give attention to. So take a minute and stop trying to work and think about those things that are flittering through your head, and honor them and try and give them the attention they need. Alrighty, so that's enough on the reticular formation. Continuing on in the tegmentum, we also have the substantia nigra, and that is part of the basal ganglia. It's part of the basal ganglia circuit. So the substantia nigra is in the midbrain, but it has fibers, dopaminergic fibers that lead to the basal ganglia. And this pathway of dopaminergic fibers from the substantia nigra to the basal ganglia is abnormal in Parkinson's disease. And so we'll talk about that in the next section of class. So substantia nigra is important in movement. There's the red nucleus, and that is for descending motor pathways, gives motor information. That's the last time I'll ever mention it. It's not going to be on the test. The periaqueductal gray. This is important in pain. So there are pain reflexes. Analgesia can occur here, and your endogenous opioids or your opioids, if you take morphine, they inhibit signals in the periaqueductal gray. So that's going to be decreasing the pain signals. Other things are species typical behaviors like fighting and mating are there as well. And then the last thing we'll mention in the tegmentum, the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. And just write this in. I should have written it in your notes. This produces a lot of dopamine. It's the largest dopamine producing area in the brain. And it's important in reward and motivation. There's a pathway that goes between the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, which is in the basal ganglia, and that's your reward addiction motivation pathway. All right, so that's the midbrain. Moving on to the hindbrain. Here we are in the hindbrain. Hindbrain has the metencephalon, which is the pons and cerebellum, and then the myelencephalon, here's the medulla. So let's talk about the pons. Pons is this lump right here, and here's the cerebellum. What is the function of the pons? Actually, I'm going to add one. Sorry, I'm going to add another one. So I gave you a big list and left one off. So sleep and arousal is controlled in part by the pons, and specifically REM sleep. REM sleep is controlled by the pons. Respiratory sensors. That is, in order to breathe, you need your medulla. But in order to breathe nicely, you need the pons. So without the medulla, without the pons, you will breathe. You'll breathe in and out, but it's not a nice rhythm. It's very, it's very uneven. And it's actually called Cheyne-Stokes breathing. It's a sign of, and the end is near because the pons is no longer functioning. It's, you're breathing, but not nice and smooth and even. And so the pons help smooth out breathing. And one other thing that the pons is important for, it's where the locus ceruleus, blue body, where the locus ceruleus lives, is in the pons. And this is an important area, it synthesizes the most norepinephrine in the brain. And this is important also for attention. So basically your brain gets bored when it's looking at things that don't change, but locus coeruleus helps you pay attention to new stimuli. And it helps produce norepinephrine. So think about it, it's fight or flight. Look, the bear is coming, it's new. But if the bear is just sitting in the corner for an hour, 3 hours, eventually you're going to stop paying attention to the bear. But the new bear, you're going to pay attention to. And those with ADHD often take Ritalin or Adderall, which is speed, and which increases norepinephrine. And people think, why are you taking speed if you have ADHD? But the reason is because norepinephrine is involved with the locus coeruleus, which is involved with focus and paying attention. Okay, so these are the 3 things I want you to know about the pons. All right, cerebellum. Cerebellum is also in the metencephalon, and it means little brain, and it's really dense. It contains over half the total number of neurons in the central nervous system, but it only is 11% of that total brain mass. So it's when you do a brain dissection, the cerebrum is gushy, but the cerebellum is much firmer. And what the cerebellum does, balance, posture, coordination, just learn that. But it gets input from the motor cortex and the brainstem and sensory receptors. And what it does, it helps control balance, posture, coordination by taking in sensory information and adjusting your movements. So let's say you are walking downstairs. You walk differently than you do when you're just walking straight, because your visual system and your vestibular system says, oh, I'm walking downstairs. And if you're in high heels, that changes your balance and you adjust your movements based on sensory information coming in, goes to the cerebellum, and you adjust your balance, posture, coordination movements based on that sensory information coming in. Cerebellum also plays a role in language and speech and planning and reading maps. So we're learning a lot more about the cerebellum. We used to think it was just balance, posture, coordination, but it's also reasoning and regulating emotions and social capacity and reward. So this is fairly new. We didn't know this when I was in grad school, but it plays a role in a lot of other things other than balance, posture, coordination. But on a test, the correct answer is balance, posture, coordination. Now, interestingly enough, there are people who don't have a cerebellum. This is a man who was born without a cerebellum. And there's another one. There's a guy who was a basketball player in college, and in high school, and he had no cerebellum, but he was born without it. So other areas of the brain took over. So look, no cerebellum, no cerebellum. That's where it should be. So you can live without it. Now, if I were to take out your cerebellum now, you would have a lot of problems. But since he was born without it, brain's very plastic. It changes, and it adapted. So what the cerebellum does, takes in sensory input and integrates it to the motor output. So it gets in information from your visual cortex. Proprioceptors is where am I in space? And sends a signal to cerebellum and changes your movement based on that sensory information. And it's largely inhibitory, just to kind of refine your movements. Now, cerebellum, I'm going to skip some of the stuff in your notes because we will talk about it more in the next section. So for now, balance, posture, coordination, all right? It's taking in sensory information and adjusting balance, posture, coordination based on that sensory information. So don't worry about the peduncles. There's a whole bunch of peduncles, which is fun to say. I will not ask it on this test. But let's close it out with the hindbrain. We're still in the hindbrain, the myelencephalon, the medulla. That is your basic vegetative processes. So that's going to make sure your heart keeps beating. Well, your heart will beat. Your heart beats even if you rip it out of the chest and put it on a table. But it's going to send signals down to from the vagus nerve to keep it at like 70 beats per minute. It's going to send signals to keep you breathing. So this one you do need for breathing. Pons makes breathing nice. Medulla sends the signals to make your diaphragm contract. Your vomiting, coughing, swallowing reflexes, these basic vegetative processes are all located in the medulla. And there it is. There's our journey through the brain. Isn't it cool? So let's close this one out. All right, bye.